Alright, welcome to the Western Hunting Gateways YouTube channel. So what I'm going to do with this channel is I'm going to take the opportunity to talk a lot about statistics for Western hunting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a lot of graphics and charts, and then I'm going to talk about harvest statistics, population statistics, hunt drawing statistics, all that sort of thing, and I'm going to illustrate that. The goal for the channel is to be able to educate people who maybe haven't hunted out west before and get them enough initial information to get them in that direction. Be able to kind of have them make informed decisions and be able to go on these hunts that they think might not have been possible. So the goal of this channel is just to get information out there. So the episode I'm going to start with today is just going to be a whitetail hunter's intro to Western mule deer. It's going to be a whirlwind tour of all the mule deer hunting options out west that exist, what over-the-counter tags are, how do you get them, different terrain options, public land type stuff, population data, which states have higher mule deer populations, which states have lower mule deer populations, and then what dates a lot of the seasons take place and how mule deer migrate along with those seasons on a mountain. So I hope you enjoy the video, and stay tuned for future stuff that we're going to do on the channel. But thanks for being here. Alright, so the first thing we're going to go over is the over-the-counter options that exist in all the states. As you can see from the kind of poor graphic that I have drawn, we have over-the-counter states here in green for rifle tags, over-the-counter states for archery tags in yellow, and then these are all our limited entry states for non-residents. In a lot of these red colored states here, the limited entry ones, residents can pick up these tags over the counter. But I'm going to briefly go over the systems for each state for the over the counter ones and tell you how you can actually pick that up and some of the nuances they might have. So for Idaho, they have over the counter tags, but they're capped at 15,000 tags for non-residents. This year, they went on sale in December 1st, 2019, and by June 26th, of 2020, they were all sold out. So they actually sold out all their non-resident tags this year, which is kind of an early date for that. A lot of the time, the tags don't go sold, or they don't sell out for non-residents, and then they end up being purchased by residents of Idaho. So they do have an over-the-counter tag in Idaho, but it's capped. Moving on to Washington, they have an over-the-counter tag that isn't capped. They do have less ideal public land than Idaho for mule deer. They do have some in the southeast portion of the state that's pretty good mule deer stuff. The northeast portion of the state is really ruled by whitetails, and then the Cascades are kind of prime blacktail stuff. Although you do get some decent mule deer hunting on the east slope of the Cascades. But this is a true over-the-counter mule deer tag, and it's not capped at all. So if for some reason you missed Idaho stuff and it sold out before you were able to purchase it, you could run over to Washington and purchase an over-the-counter tag there. Going over to Nebraska, they have a similar structure to Idaho, whereas each unit has a certain quota, and then when they go on sale, it sells until they sell out. This year, the Pine Ridge unit, which is kind of their most famous unit that has a decent amount of public land, sold out the day after the tags went on sale. So the 1,200 tags there disappeared pretty quick. This year, for whatever reason, the tags in Idaho and Nebraska sold out really quickly. So I guess a lot of people, for some reason, are coming to these states this year. And then I'm going to briefly go over California because they do technically have over-the-counter rifle tags. They're just much lower quality than the other states. Their over-the-counter mule deer stuff takes place in the Sierras, and the success rates are really low, somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% success. Whereas their better mule deer units in northeast California and kind of the east slope of the Sierras right here, those are limited entry units, so that's their kind of premium stuff. Their over-the-counter tags in California are actually very low quality. But I'm going to briefly then go over a lot of the limited entry systems as well. So there's kind of two ways of looking at it. There's either a preference point system, which is the people with the most points draw. Say if you have 2 points and there's people ahead of you with 4, 5, 6 points, they will all draw the tags before you. Wyoming runs it that way. Colorado runs it that way. Utah runs it that way for their general season mule deer, and Montana runs it that way for their general season mule deer. The other option is kind of a bonus point system, or more like a raffle draw. So the number of points you have determines the number of names you have in the hat. This is an simplification of the situation because some of these states get complicated with their bonus points and they square them and that sort of thing. But for all intents and purposes, Nevada does the raffle draw. Montana does the raffle draw for their limited entry mule deer stuff, which even though they have a general season mule deer for non-residents, it's still limited entry, if that makes any kind of sense. So for the Montana residents, they can pick up that general season tag over the counter, and then they apply for limited entry units. Whereas us non-residents, we enter a preference point draw for their general season and a bonus point draw for their limited entry stuff. Utah's the same way. They do a bonus point draw for their premium limited entry units like the Henry Mountains in southern Utah and Ponsaugunt, probably pronounced that wrong, but also in southern Utah. New Mexico is completely random draw, so there's no bonus points, no preference points. It's a total random draw in New Mexico. North Dakota is an interesting option because they don't really have a rifle option for non-residents. It's pretty much an archery option, and it's limited entry. But the odds of drawing that are pretty good. It's like 70% without any points, that sort of thing. Kansas is a preference point draw. You apply for a preference point to get drawn for a whitetail tag, and then you apply for a random draw with no points factored in for a mule deer stamp. That stamp is only good for archery and muzzleloader. For non-residents, there is no way for a non-resident to hunt mule deer with a rifle in Kansas. South Dakota has the over-the-counter archery permit. You can just pick that up over the counter and hunt. Oregon has the same thing, and Arizona has kind of the gem of the over-the-counter archery stuff. That over-the-counter archery permit works for September season, and then fast forward, it also works for December and the rut season that goes on in January. So bang for your buck, Arizona's got a pretty decent over-the-counter tag if you're willing to switch to archery. So that's just a general overview of all the ways you can obtain these permits out west. So from there, I'm going to kind of go on to the next portion and talk about the populations in each of these states. Alright, so same kind of crummy graphic, different information I put on it. So what I did was I sorted out all the states based on their population estimates for mule deer. So over here, you guys can read the graphic, but I'll go over it really briefly. You have the lower population plains states, because it's less ideal habitat, and they're stratified by which ones have the most populations. The caveat with North Dakota is this 20,000 mule deer population estimate is only for their Badlands zone, so they don't do an estimate of their other mule deer habitat within North Dakota, which is the river breaks and all that sort of thing. They only estimate it for their Badlands zone. So the 20,000 is a limited portion of North Dakota. The ones that I have this kind of wavy line by means roughly 120,000 mule deer. That means these are more rough population estimates than the other states are fielding. I actually should have put that for Montana too, because Montana doesn't have a lot of confidence in this population estimate. It's not survey based, it's harvest based. But you can see as you kind of move on into the Rockies, the population increases. The other caveat that comes with this was with Oregon and California. So these super high population estimates from Oregon and California are blacktail and mule deer combined. So, for example, a lot of the deer in California are going to be blacktails. California is a huge blacktail state. So over half of this 459,000 deer that they estimate in California are going to be blacktails, technically, instead of mule deer. Kind of the same thing with Oregon. I think Oregon is more 50-50. And the reason I kind of double-colored Washington up here is because this estimate is only mule deer. If you added blacktails, they'd be kind of bumped up into the yellow range, about 350,000. But with just the mule deer, they're in this kind of 200,000-ish range, which puts them more in the green. So it's kind of unfair that Washington was displayed this way, but this is the way I was able to find the data on their population estimates. Another thing to note is that the desert states, obviously the drier states, have less mule deer than the wetter Rocky Mountain states, but they do still have mule deer. I had a friend who actually hunted mule deer most of his life in Utah and was kind of confused that I really like mule deer hunting in Nevada. He just didn't think there was a viable mule deer hunting resource in Nevada. I mean, don't get me wrong, population in Nevada is absolutely dwarfed by Utah, but it is still there, and there is still really good mule deer hunting in all these low population states if you're in the right area. So this is a general overview of the population of mule deer in each state, and it can kind of give you an idea of where you'd want to look at for hunting mule deer. Personally, this is why I look at Colorado a lot for hunting mule deer, because their population density is going to be a lot higher than a state like New Mexico that just has a lower mule deer population estimate. Alright, from there we're going to go into the next portion and kind of talk about season dates. Alright, so for this one I have hopefully a little more interesting of a graphic for you guys to look at here. But what I'm going to be talking about is the season dates for mule deer and kind of where there can be at terrain-wise during those seasons. So I'm going to start off where it's easiest, with the early seasons. So for early season mule deer in a mountain state, it varies on plain states obviously because states like Nebraska and South Dakota don't have topography like this. But for a mountain state, this is the general pattern that mule deer follow throughout the seasons, and then the general season pattern that kind of comes with that. So for the early season stuff where mule deer are super high up on the mountain here, in this kind of this illustrated red zone here, that's usually kind of their summer range, like June, July, August, kind of on into early September sort of thing. So a lot of the states are running their archery seasons during that time frame. So these early seasons are usually going to be archery. So early season, that is really thick. So for these early seasons, that's going to be archery. And this is kind of where they're going to hang out on the mountain during those early seasons. They're in velvet this time of year, and this is where there's going to be the best moisture, because this is the last area where the snowpack melts on the mountains. If it does melt, there's states obviously like Washington and Colorado that have a lot more glaciers, and then you'll still see in through the summer snowpack up high on those mountains. But as a generalization, you're going to see mule deer more up high when they're in velvet on this kind of zone of the mountain. And those are usually archery tags. States like Colorado have some very highly sought after early rifle tags. Those tags are super sought after, taking somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 years of applying in Colorado to draw this early season rifle tag. Washington does the same thing with over-the-counter tags, but Washington seems to be targeting more blacktails when they're up high. They just don't have as much mule deer habitat up high with the Cascade range. That tends to be the range of the blacktails in the Cascades, whereas a lot of their mule deer are on the scablands in central Washington, and then kind of the foothills in eastern Washington. So even though Washington has the high buck hunts, that's what they call them, those are purveying more so to blacktails and mule deer. Alright, so I'm going to kind of transition on then into the next kind of stage. So we'll go through this step by step here. We're going to go into the kind of early to mid stage is what I'm going to call it. So at this stage, mule deer are still going to be up high, but they're going to kind of be more hidden in maybe this zone of the mountain. So we'll kind of illustrate it as this zone of the mountain. Maybe they're dipping more into the pinyon junipers because they've just shedded their velvet right now. So they tend to dive more into the timber during this time of year. So maybe this changes. This is their core range. They'll still come up into these drainages, especially if they have water, but for the most part, this is where they're going to be at, kind of starting, we'll say, in September. So they're in kind of a transition. This is kind of a transition zone for the deer this time of year. They'll be, during the daytime, they're going to start being more nocturnal. They're going to be bedding in these juniper trees. But since it's still relatively warm in September, they're still going to be wanting to hang out up high, and they'll still be coming to moisture that's up in the high country. So they'll kind of be moving back and forth through this zone. You might find them up here this time of year. You might find them as low as down there. You're going to find them wherever they can find a way to survive. But for the most part, they're going to be in kind of a transitional pattern this time of year. The seasons that usually take place in this early to mid zone are going to be your muzzleloader seasons. So the states that follow that kind of that plan or that structure for the archery first, then muzzleloader, and then later on we'll get into rifle stuff, but are going to be Colorado and Nevada. A lot of the other states, well, actually I think Arizona does a similar structure, and New Mexico even does a similar structure to that. It just happens later on because those are warmer states. Everything gets bumped back a couple of months for New Mexico and Arizona. But for at least for Nevada and Colorado, this is when they run their muzzleloader seasons, kind of in a September time frame. Range. They'll be just shedding their velvet kind of within the first week of this season. So from there, I'm going to move on into the kind of the bulk of the season stuff. So we're going to get to kind of let's use this color. We'll get into what I call the late mid-season. So during this time of year, you start to get snow falling and accumulating here. This is going to be maybe the mid part of October. So mid part of October in Colorado, you can get a lot of snow up here, and that's going to push a lot of the deer down, especially the does. They're just going to follow the better forage. So during that time of year, they're going to start to dip down into thicker juniper cover. So this band of junipers that you see here is going to kind of become their primary range. They're going to follow the snow line as it goes down the mountain. So this is their primary range now in the late to mid-season. Alright, this is actually an easier tag to draw because it's the hardest time to hunt mule deer. They're not rutting yet. They're no longer up high on the mountain, out in the open. They kind of tend to stick close to cover. They're very nocturnal, and they're in this juniper range. So the earlier rifle tags that are available, say the early tag in Nevada or the early rifle tag in Colorado, are the easiest ones in those states to draw because it's the hardest time to hunt mule deer. They're not as easy as the archery tags to draw because archery is a difficult hunt. It's a harder sort of thing. So the archery tags are still easy to draw. But in early rifle tag is much harder to draw than this kind of late mid rifle tag that we have here. And because of this, they actually give out more tags for these zones because they expect a lower harvest success rate, and that's that contributes to that being the kind of the biggest season time for mule deer. Let's go into the late zone. Use this one. So late season, we're talking November time frame now. Oh, these are both rifle. Alright, so we're talking November time frame now. Imagine we got a bunch of snow up above kind of the juniper cover here, and then you got snow going down through the junipers. Maybe if a higher elevation unit in Colorado, you got snow, less deep snow, but snow all the way down to here. They're moving down to kind of the lowest portion of the terrain this time of year, so we're going to kind of paint their range in this sort of area. So we've got this sort of delineation here. The cool thing about this picture of the mountain range that I picked is there's a super clear delineation between sagebrush right up here and then grass down here. So the sagebrush is the kind of the main wintertime forage for mule deer, whereas grass is actually really poor quality forage. Mule deer don't tend to be able to get a lot of nutrition out of grass. So where you see the sagebrush in these lower foothills, that's indicative of their winter range. So this is where they do a lot of their rutting. They'll be more visible this time of year. They're more accessible to hunting because they're in the lower elevation here on the mountain, closer to roads, closer to people, and less difficult, less hiking to get up to. So it's a more vulnerable time of year for the mule deer, and it's an easier hunt. They're rutting, they're out in the open, all that sort of stuff. They do still use the junipers as thermal cover, obviously, during this season. Like I was saying, for late mid, they're in the junipers a lot. In this type of season, they're still hanging around the junipers, although during the rut they'll be active, but they'll still be hanging around in the junipers just so they can kind of get shelter from cold winds and that sort of thing that time of year. So this is a kind of a simplification of where mule deer are in a mountain range during the different times of year and what sort of season dates you can expect for these, going all the way from August to September to October to then some November seasons, and what weapon types occur for each of these seasons. From here, I'm going to get onto some public land access tidbits. Alright, so for this one, I've got another crudely drawn graphic for you guys, but I'll be illustrating some public land access entry-level information. So I'm going to start by drawing some roads on here. We'll make this thicker one our main highway that goes through the unit. We'll say there's a big highway that cuts through here. Alright, and then from there, let's do some county roads. Let's shoot a county road up through here. County road here. And then we'll get some Forest Service roads, BLM roads, and that sort of thing. And then let's throw some dirt road 2 tracks in. So these are your poorly maintained dirt roads. We'll send that through some parts of the units here. Alright. So, brief overview of the public land types you usually would be hunting on out west. You've got your Forest Service land here, which is on, if you see it on a map or an atlas, it's usually going to be in green. So this represents your Forest Service, NF, National Forest. And then you've got Bureau of Land Management land, which is also available hunting. Usually on maps, you'll see it in yellow, and depending on what state you're hunting, there can be more BLM land, like Nevada, primarily BLM, or more Forest Service land in a state like Idaho or Washington. Washington's almost entirely Forest Service land, hardly any BLM, whereas Nevada is kind of the inverse. But there's some interesting nuances with road access to different pieces of public land, and that's what I'm going to go over. The main thing to remember when accessing pieces of public land is if the road is publicly maintained, then you can use it. Since this is a state highway, this is a publicly maintained road, and all the land that touches it is accessible. Since this is a county road, it is maintained by the county, and all the land that touches it is publicly accessible. The stuff where it gets tricky is when you see a dirt road going off here. This dirt road might be private. You run into this a lot in Wyoming. So even though there's a road going to a piece of public land, this piece of public land is not accessible because this is not a publicly maintained road. The best way I've found to figure out if a road is publicly maintained is to look at the county's website and get their maps of what the publicly maintained roads are. I had to do that for an antelope hunt. I went on in around Casper in, I think it's Niobrara County, Wyoming, but I got that county's map of all their county roads, so I found out where I could access different pieces. So if you had a county road and then there was a dirt road then in the public going off, you can use this road. This is public. You just can't access this one because it passes through this private land here. Another big caveat that you can run into is this sort of thing. We call this corner crossing out west. You'll end up with a lot of smaller parcels of public land out west that are all the same size because of the way the land plots are sold. But if you have public land running through this one, this portion here is accessible. You can obviously access this. You cannot necessarily access this unit here. Or not unit, but this piece of public land here isn't necessarily accessible because it only touches on the very corner of the square. So what it's basically implying is that a human being cannot physically shrink down to a certain point and cross right here, so that just by geometry you cannot cross from this one to this one without trespassing because you will pass through space that is privately owned. So even though these kind of touch on their corners, you cannot access this one for the most part. It varies based on states, and there's been a lot of lawsuits and litigation on it. But this one is inaccessible because it doesn't technically have overlap with this one that has the public access. Another thing you can run into is that state land isn't always huntable for every state. Colorado is super weird when it comes to this because some of their state land is huntable, some of it's completely closed, some of it's for ag development purposes. It varies. So you would have to, if you look at Colorado, you would have to look up that specific piece of state land and find in the regulations where it says if it's open or not. So that's another caveat that comes with state land. BLM land and Forest Service land for most intents and purposes and most of the time is open to hunting when it has a publicly accessible road linking it. So your best bet is to look at the BLM land, Bureau of Land Management, and the Forest Service land there and find which ones have publicly maintained roads leading to them. So that's just a general overview of the public land access type stuff out west. And then from there, I'm just going to move on into a brief overview of terrain and then wrap this thing up. Alright, so what I'm going to go over really briefly in this one is just terrain options for western mule deer hunting. So after you've looked at a state, say you've narrowed it down to Idaho or Nebraska, or you're going to do a limited entry thing in New Mexico, you have to decide what kind of terrain you want to hunt. So there'll be different units in these states, and I'm going to cover the differences between units really in depth with the next kind of part of this series when I talk about my first mule deer hunt in Wyoming. But this is just going to be a brief overview of the terrain options in different states. So when you've decided on a state, Then you have to decide on what unit you want to hunt, what kind of terrain is in that unit, based on what you want out of it. So, say if you wanted to hunt something like this in the Great Plains, rolling hills type of thing, or Badlands, you'd want to look at not necessarily even a different unit. At that point, that might be what makes it a state you want to hunt at that point, if you want to hunt that type of terrain. Obviously, you're not going to get this type of terrain necessarily, say, in California or New Mexico or Arizona. You're going to look to a plains state if you want to hunt that. And then you get everything in between from there on. You get super high country units in this. This unit actually has a lot of aspen trees. That's what this darker green is here. That's all aspen cover. So if you're fine with hunting a unit that has a lot of high country aspen cover, then this might be your unit. If you want a more open country Badlands unit, this might be the way you're going. And then you have all sorts of other options. If you want a really high country rugged unit that has big timber, I think these were ponderosa pines or white pines, a lot of this unit, then this might be the one you would want to look at. It also varies based on, like I said earlier, with the different seasons where mule deer are. This unit right here, this area being high country, might not be a good unit to do for a late November hunt. This might be a better unit in August or September because the deer will be up higher before the snow falls. If the snow starts falling, they might migrate to a unit more like this one over here, which is kind of low country basins with a lot of sagebrush and juniper cover. In this particular example, actually, a lot of the mule deer hang out up here. Yeah, let me illustrate this for you. A lot of the deer hang out here up in higher country, and then they migrate down into these basins. I don't know why I wrote like that, but they migrate down into these basins during the winter season. So if you wanted to hunt this specific area, you might want to look at a later time of year. So when you're planning a hunt, get on Google Earth. That's probably one of your best ways of looking at it. Look at their satellite images, look at their street views where you drag and drop onto the street, and then get a kind of a feel for what area you want to hunt. Have that kind of planned out in your head ahead of time. And then start looking at it and see where you can find that sort of thing. If terrain is a really important thing to you. For me it is. I like to hunt really open country, so I like plains units and really high country units like this one. And then sometimes I even like the lower country units, but I run into a lot of junipers there. But I do like a specific kind of terrain when I'm planning out my mule deer hunts, so this is something that I find very important. This is something I like to look at. Alright, so from there, I'm going to take us back to our first graphic, and then I'm going to just kind of summarize. So, in summary, there's a lot of different options. Where I would steer the first time western mule deer hunter in the direction of is actually Colorado. It's actually Colorado. Reason for that, even though they're a limited entry state, you can obtain a tag there without any points. The way you do that is Colorado has their primary draw, then they have a secondary draw, and then anything that wasn't picked up in the secondary draw can be obtained in the leftover purchasing period. What I would do if I was serious about hunting Colorado is I would look and see what units were left over for the secondary draw, and then I would apply for those units in the primary draw. So for example, if you saw that unit 45 didn't sell out in the primary draw and was available in the secondary draw, next year go ahead and apply for unit 45 in their primary draw, and there's a good chance that you're going to draw because it's usually left over for the secondary draw. The way you can get that information is the actual name of the document that you would look at is 2020 secondary draw deer licenses. That's what it's called, 2020 secondary draw deer licenses. And then you would see the list of stuff that's available. Colorado is a good state for beginners because you have a huge variety of terrain. So you don't necessarily have to hunt the high country units on the spine of the Rockies in Colorado. You can go over to the west side of the state, hunt some lower country here, and they still have pretty big mule deer populations on some of these west slope units in Colorado. So you'd be hunting a bigger population, and you get a huge variety of terrain. There's good public land. That's a really good state for beginners. Another one, if you don't want to go through the hassle of the draw, is Idaho. It's a little harder because central Idaho has this whole portion right about here is a wilderness area that has no vehicle access. So it can be very intimidating to a beginning mule deer hunter to be able to explore this area that has no mule deer access. And honestly, most people that want to hunt really deep within this area, it's called the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. But people get actually dropped off by float planes, or they contract guides with horses to hunt this unit. But if I was a first-time mule deer hunter and I wanted to do Idaho, I would look at some of these units right here in southern Idaho. Easier terrain, not as much wilderness areas, so good road access, and there's still good public land in these units. There might be more hunters there because it's more easily accessible than some of this more rugged wilderness terrain up here. But they still have a pretty good mule deer population down there. And if you're not looking for an absolute trophy, you just want to go hunting, this could be a good area to look at. If you don't do that, I would recommend this corner in Washington. There is a decent amount of Forest Service land here. It's pretty good terrain too, with mixed kind of rolling hills, sagebrush, and juniper. And this tag can be obtained over the counter without any caps. So yes, there'll be a lot of pressure here. There is actually a smaller wilderness area kind of in this portion. But since it's a lot smaller than this, people can actually just hike in and hunt this area much more easily. So even though there's a lot of pressure here, there are ways to get away from the pressure in southeast Washington. I don't recommend California at all for first-time mule deer hunters. And honestly, as much as I like Nebraska, I don't recommend it either because it has, I think it's about 5% of Nebraska's public land. And that public land, since it's an over-the-counter tag, gets absolutely hammered in Nebraska. Because if people are willing to spend the $700 on the statewide buck tag and kind of circumvent the individual unit caps, then an unlimited number of people can hunt Nebraska over the counter and just swamp that public land. If you were doing an archery hunt, then maybe a different story, but I definitely don't recommend Nebraska as for the first time mule deer hunter. I would steer you in the direction of Colorado, Idaho, or Washington. So the next kind of portion, what I'm going to do in kind of a further episode, is I'm going to go over my Wyoming example, my first time hunting mule deer in Wyoming, and kind of the individual unit structures they have in Wyoming, looking at units, planning around point systems, looking at terrain options, looking at season dates and that sort of thing. So I'm going to go super in depth on Wyoming. The video I did today was just a whirlwind tour of the mule deer hunting opportunities out west. I hope you enjoyed it, and I thank you for your support.